It's 2035, and something about the United States feels off. The economy is in shambles, prices are out of control. The American dream, a distant memory. The country's no longer the powerhouse it used to be, and inflation has spiraled for years. A gallon of milk costs $20. Rent is triple what it was. People are struggling just to get by. How did this happen? It all came down to a calculated strategy, one China put into motion more than a decade ago, and it had nothing to do with war. No bombs, no soldiers, no invasions. It was all about money, and it worked. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're going to reveal the master plan China is enacting right now to overtake the United States by 2035. In 2024, China's own state-run media, Global Times, confirmed what many had feared. China's rise to economic dominance was well underway. Experts cited in the report predicted that China's relentless economic momentum would make it the world's largest economy by 2035. A global think tank, including analysts from China, India, Russia, Canada, and the US, revealed the 2035 projection and outlined the key drivers behind China's strategy. The foundation of this takeover is a sustained and cumulative compounding interest, a highly productive workforce, and the rapid expansion of high-quality, globally competitive industries. But there's more to it than that. The 2035 scenario was just one of 10 possible futures experts outlined, but it is the one that seems most likely. Under this plan, China doesn't need to skyrocket its economy. It simply needs to maintain a steady 5% GDP growth over the next few years. Even 4% per year would be enough as it gets closer to 2035. And so far, China has been delivering. Since 1990, it has consistently hit 5% or higher GDP growth, with only 3 exceptions: 3.9% in 1990, 2.2% in 2020, largely due to COVID, and 3% in 2022. Every other year has been a win for Beijing. In 2023, China achieved 5.2% GDP growth, and its highest single-year surge was a staggering 14.2% in 2007. Even more telling, the last time China's economy actually shrank was in 1976. For nearly 5 decades, its momentum has been relentlessly upward. The predictions for what the GDP future may hold doesn't look much better for the US. Statista says that China's overtaking the US in this department may come sooner than expected. In 2020, China's GDP stood at $14.8 trillion, while the US maintained a comfortable lead at $20.8 trillion, a $6 trillion gap. However, projections indicate that this lead will shrink to just $3 trillion by the end of 2025. By 2030, China is expected to overtake the US entirely, reaching $33.7 trillion compared to America's $30.4 trillion. From there, China's economic growth accelerates rapidly. By 2035, China's GDP is projected to skyrocket to $49.1 trillion, while the US will only manage a modest increase to $36.2 trillion. COVID appears to have been the only thing that slowed China down. But with the issue resolved, it's right back on the path to becoming the world's economic powerhouse. And it's the US that'll feel the brunt of the turnaround. The big question is, how is all of this happening? China's plan to overtake the US economically is complex and multifaceted, but it starts with something that we can all understand. China has far more workers than the US, and it's already benefiting from this labor advantage to make itself the country to go to when it comes to large-scale manufacturing. It's a staggering thought, considering the US still boasts one of the world's most dynamic economies. However, China's massive workforce, around 750 million strong, is a game-changer. That's more than 4.4 times larger than America's 170.7 million workers. On the most basic level, this sheer manpower gives China the ability to produce over 4 times as many goods as the US, providing it with an overwhelming advantage in industrial output, manufacturing, and economic growth. With this kind of workforce, China isn't just competing, it is surging ahead. And China's economic growth is far from over. Many in the US has comforted themselves with the idea that we're already witnessing peak China. The notion that after decades of rapid expansion, China's economy has reached a natural slowdown and it'll never surpass the US. While China may not stagnate, some argue that its growth will no longer be fast enough to overtake America. However, this belief may be a myth. According to Wang Wen of Renmin University's Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, China's economic rise is still gaining momentum. The idea of peak China is nothing more than wishful thinking. Why? It's all about urbanization. China's urbanization rate is only 65%. If calculated at 80% in the future, it means that another 200 to 300 million people will enter urban areas, which will generate a huge increase in the real economy, claims Wang. In other words, China still isn't close to taking full advantage of its much larger workforce. When it does, the US will be in trouble. Contrast America's 83.3% urbanization rate as of 2023 to the 65% currently achieved by China, and there is only one conclusion: China has plenty of room to grow its economy. It's the US that may have already hit its peak. The first phase of China's grand economic strategy is to accelerate urbanization, moving more of its massive population into cities where they can contribute to high productivity industries that drive GDP growth. But this plan doesn't stop there. A second, more diabolical element takes direct advantage of one of America's greatest economic motivators: corporate greed. By convincing US companies to outsource manufacturing, China can not only secure a steady flow of investment, but also weaken America's industrial base. Since the 1990s, China has strategically positioned itself as the world's factory, making it the go-to destination for companies looking for cheap, large-scale manufacturing. Beijing laid the bait, and American corporations took it, hook, line, and sinker. The reason is simple: wages. In China, even the highest minimum wages are a fraction of what US workers earn. Shanghai's top monthly minimum wage sits at just $370, while Beijing holds the highest hourly rate at $3.70. Compare that to the US, where the federal minimum wage remains $7.25 an hour, nearly double Beijing's best rate. But in reality, $7.25 an hour isn't even a livable wage in many US states, forcing places like California and New York to raise their minimum wages to $16 to $16.50 per hour, more than 4 times China's highest rate. For corporations focused on cutting costs, the math is clear: manufacturing in China is significantly cheaper than in the US. China also benefits from having far fewer regulatory requirements than the US when it comes to how well it treats its employees. Workers generally receive no form of compensation insurance, and Chinese factories have long used child labor combined with much longer shift hours to get the absolute most out of their population. Beijing is one of the most polluted cities in the world, and while China has recently introduced clean air policies to improve conditions in its manufacturing hubs, its history tells a different story. As recently as 2019, the World Bank reported that 18 of the 20 most polluted cities on the planet were in China. The country's leaders have happily sacrificed health and regulatory concerns to make more money, and have now switched focus to cleaner air so their workers last longer. The long and the short of it is that it's far cheaper to make products in China than it is in the US. American companies have taken advantage of that fact, with BCG revealing that over 90% of them have relocated production between 2018 and 2023. And of those 90%, around half claim to have shifted at least 20% of their manufacturing and supply chain spending abroad. Of course, not all of those companies are sending work to China. Mexico, India, and several other nations receive just as much work from American companies. However, China played a massive role in shaping the US outsourcing trend, and now it's reaping the rewards as part of a carefully crafted master plan. By encouraging American companies to shift manufacturing overseas, China has made the US dependent on foreign labor, weakening its ability to produce for itself. The result is a nation that once led the world in manufacturing, now struggling to sustain its own industries. And for China, that reliance has funneled billions of dollars into its economy, accelerating its rise while the US grows increasingly dependent. America's short-term focus on higher profits via exploitation of China's underpaid workforce was part of the plan all along. After all, China was exploiting its workers long before it started encouraging other countries to do the same. But the Chinese 2035 plan goes deeper. Beyond the cheaper labor and China's aggressive focus on GDP growth, there's another aspect that is key to China overtaking the US: unity. Chinese President Xi Jinping has meticulously fostered a culture of nationalistic pride, shaping a society where citizens are expected to work collectively toward the country's long-term goals. This emphasis on unity isn't just rhetoric, it's a driving force behind China's economic momentum. In fact, national unity was the key theme of Xi's message during his July 2024 diplomatic tour of neighboring Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, as well as at the 24th meeting of the Council of Heads of State of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. These visits reinforced China's commitment to regional influence and economic expansion, both essential elements of its path to global dominance. That event saw China welcome Belarus as a new SCO member. We'll get to China's deepening ties with other countries soon. And it saw Xi reference what China calls the Shanghai spirit. She also claimed that in the face of the challenge of interference and division, all members of the SCO must join China in consolidating unity. Don't underestimate the impact of this messaging. Xi has relied on it for decades to build China into an economic and military powerhouse. And Xi Jinping understands the power of national unity so well that he hasn't just strengthened it within China. He has actively worked to weaken it in the United States. To Beijing, a divided America is a vulnerable America. The more the U.S. is consumed by political infighting, social unrest, and economic uncertainty, the less attention it pays to China's steady rise. Part of China's plan is to reshape global perception, not just of itself but of the U.S. as the most powerful nation in the world. It's spending billions of dollars annually on these types of campaigns. The approaches vary, and they even include seemingly benign examples, such as holding state-sponsored events, as China did in September 2023. That event saw Beijing invite 22 journalists from 17 different countries to explore Chinese bazaars, talk with residents, and even enjoy a few watermelon slices. The reports from the journalists all came back claiming China is a country full of cultural, religious, and ethnic diversity, again feeding into the unity narrative she wants to create. As for the US, it's now facing a digital battlefield where artificial intelligence is China's most powerful weapon. Beijing has been using AI to generate entire networks of fake news websites designed to look like legitimate media outlets, while secretly pushing pro-China and anti-US narratives. It's all about manipulation of the audience, according to Shannon Van Sant of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Manipulation of the media is ultimately a manipulation of readers and the audience, says Van Sant. And this is damaging to democracy and society. Therein lies the key to this aspect of China's plan to overtake the US. It's using fake news websites, so built to almost directly mimic respected outlets like the New York Times, to spread propaganda. It's also using what some experts dub spamouflage. These are fake Chinese social media accounts taking on American personas to spread fake information or inflame debates. Graphica identified 15 of these accounts on X, one on TikTok, and an account impersonating American news outlets in a small study in 2024. And there are likely hundreds of these sorts of fake accounts on the net. It's all about influence by any means necessary to create division. What purpose does that division serve? Simple: distraction. While all of this fake news is going on, China is also doing something else very clever to ensure it overtakes the US by 2035. It's investing heavily. To sustain the 5% annual GDP growth needed to surpass the US, China must reinvest around 40% of its GDP, both domestically and in foreign markets. If Beijing chooses its investments wisely, the reinvestment strategy will not only fuel its own expansion, but also cement China's role as the primary engine of global economic growth. According to analysts, China has already been the world's main economic driver for the past 40 years, and if this trajectory continues, its dominance will only deepen. Beijing is certainly outpacing the US when it comes to foreign investments. China has already developed into the world's largest investor in other countries via its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, sometimes dubbed the New Silk Road. BRI sees China spending heavily to create infrastructure, primarily in developing countries, that ultimately benefits Beijing. Through massive investments in roads, railways, telecommunications, and energy projects, primarily in developing nations, Beijing is expanding its influence while securing economic and political leverage. The strategy has made China the world's top investor in critical infrastructure, with every dollar spent designed to strengthen its foothold in key regions. According to the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO, China poured a staggering $679 billion into BRI projects across nearly 150 countries between 2013 and 2021. This proves just how far its economic reach has extended and how much control it stands to gain. But there's a darker side to the BRI aspect of China's U.S. domination plan. All of that investment doesn't come for free. The GAO labeled China as the world's largest debt collector, pointing out that its investments mean it's owed $1.34 trillion by the nations for which it's completing BRI projects. That alone is dangerous. Collecting interest on the payments for these projects only enriches China further. However, BRI gets even more terrifying for the US when you start to dig into the contracts China signs with the nations that benefit from its investments. In 2021, several groups, including the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, examined more than 100 of the debt financing contracts that China has signed with nations that supposedly benefit from BRI. Most of these contracts included clauses that prevented the other nation from refinancing the debts it has with China to any of the group of 22 countries collectively known as the Paris Club. This club involves most of the major Western economic powers, including the US. with China's contracts ensuring that BRI nations are tied to Beijing for as long as their debt exists. The US can't take it on or help. Another worrying clause in these contracts is that China can demand repayments for the debts built up by the countries it's supposedly helping at any time. China is sitting on up to $1.5 trillion in debt that it can reclaim whenever it wants. That money could be pumped into the country's economy if it ever experienced a blip that knocks it off the path to overtaking the US. Of course, many of the countries to which China provides its BRI funding won't be able to repay their debts immediately. That's fine for Beijing too. Whatever it doesn't get back in terms of money, it receives in influence and the ability to use the infrastructure it's building in these countries for its own purposes. It all adds up to China building ties and putting itself in a position where it can use its already impressive stockpiles of money to make even more money. That's what investment is all about. We mentioned building ties just now. That brings us to yet another amazing aspect of China's plan for overtaking the United States as the world's strongest economic power: BRICS. Originally formed by Brazil, Russia, India, and China, with South Africa joining later, BRICS was created to strengthen economic cooperation among emerging powers operating outside the traditional Western hegemony. That doesn't mean these nations refuse to trade with the US and its Western counterparts. In fact, all of them do. Rather, these countries are more interested in building themselves up via the alliance than they are in supporting the West. In 2024, BRICS expanded significantly, welcoming Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates into its ranks. With these additions, the increasingly influential group came to represent 45% of the world's population, 25% of global trade, 28% of global GDP, 25% of the world's landmass, and a staggering 40% of oil production. Through BRICS, Beijing is securing influence over a massive portion of the world's energy infrastructure and global trade. While China can't yet dictate oil flow or fully unite BRICS against the West, it is clearly laying the groundwork for a future where such leverage could be possible. Plus, BRICS keeps growing. It added Indonesia as its 10th member in January 2025, with Nigeria joining shortly afterward on January 17th. BRICS represents more control over the means of production. BRICS also represents a growing grip on global energy and trade, steadily forcing the US to loosen its hold on regions where it's been long dominant. While America remains a major force in trade and energy production, its influence is slowly eroding as more nations align themselves with China. Once again, it's unity versus division. As China expands its reach through BRICS, America's control over global trade weakens. The alliance also gives Beijing a direct route into more African nations, further reinforcing its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, and expanding its economic footprint. More importantly, BRICS is enabling China to build a growing collective of anti-Western nations around itself. While geopolitical rivalries exist within BRICS, with India, for example, attempting to maintain a more neutral stance and voicing concerns over what it sees as the group's dilution, the reality is BRICS continues to grow stronger year after year. And as BRICS expands its influence, so does China. And that growing power might one day allow China to execute one of the most ambitious pieces of its grand strategy: replacing the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. China would love to create an alternative financial ecosystem to the dollar-dependent one that exists today. Right now, the US dollar is far and away the leader in reserve currencies. Nations currently maintain $6.7 trillion of the US dollar, giving the US a 59% share of all reserve funds. The euro comes next, accounting for 20% of the reserve share at $2.3 trillion. China's yuan is a long way behind at nearly $247 billion and 2% of the reserve shares, but it is the highest reserve currency by market share of what we could consider non-Western aligned nations. Still, those numbers don't suggest the dollar is going to be replaced as the world's reserve anytime soon. However, there are factors playing into China's favor here. In the past, China has possibly artificially depressed the value of the yuan, likely to give itself an edge in manufacturing that we spoke about earlier. Even as far back as 2005, the yuan was believed to be undervalued by 30% against the dollar. It's that manipulation that could set the yuan up for a sharp increase in the coming years. China has kept its currency's value low by purchasing dollars and selling yuan for several decades. What happens if the buying and selling reverses? After all, China's foreign exchange reserves currently stand at $3.2 trillion, with most of that being in US dollars. Beijing could start selling off those dollars and buying back the yuan, strengthening its own currency while hitting the dollar hard in the process. That could be the tactic across the board for China. It holds more currency and foreign reserves than any other nation. Right now, it suits China's grand plan to keep the yuan at a lower value. In the future, it may not. Pumping up the yuan later on could lead to it slowly starting to take the place of the dollar in many other nations' eyes. That could especially be the case with the US threatening tariffs against China and practically any other nation that isn't marching to the beat of the American drum. Those being stung by those tariffs, particularly any countries that aren't entrenched in the Western hegemony, may start to look toward China's currency as a viable alternative. Other Western actions have also spurred the yuan, including the many sanctions placed against Russia. For instance, bilateral trades in the yuan increased by 1/3 to 53% in July 2024, compared to 40% in the same month in 2021. China's outbound trade is increasingly being conducted outside of the dollar's ecosystem too, with the 80% figure from 2010 being halved since the West's sanctions took hold. The yuan is still a long way behind. It's used for 7% of all foreign exchange transactions versus 88% for the dollar. However, it's all about being the alternative for now. As it gets harder for some nations to deal with the dollar, China offers the yuan as a reserve and a trading currency. Over time, with the help of BRICS and the BRI, China may start influencing even more countries to trust its currency ahead of the dollar. It's a long-term plan and it won't be completed by 2035. However, the replacement of the dollar as the reserve currency is on the agenda, and there are plenty of breadcrumbs showing us that China is working toward it. And there's another part of China's grand plan: technology. China has long been accused of copying other countries' technologies. The U.S. International Trade Commission has long reported that American companies routinely suffer from intellectual property theft in China, with losses reaching $48 billion in 2009, a figure that has likely grown significantly since. But this isn't just economic fallout, it's part of a larger strategy. China's efforts go beyond passive IP infringement. They include outright theft. A prime example is Zhang Zhaoqing, a former General Electric Power employee convicted in 2023 for stealing sensitive U.S. technology. Using a technique called stenography, which hides data within other files, Zhang embedded classified GE turbine designs inside digital sunset images and sent them to an accomplice in China. It meant that Beijing fraudulently obtained cutting-edge U.S. innovations, reinforcing its own industrial and military capabilities without having to spend decades developing them. That type of theft alone would be enough of a worry. But now China wants to create better leverage over the markets. That was the statement from Xi in 2024, as he claimed that China's focus would be on all-around innovation in the coming years. Again, investment comes into play. China has already proposed new measures that allow it to invest in overseas institutions via bonds. Of course, those institutions will work on projects in the technology sector, with their results benefiting Beijing in the future. In other words, China isn't satisfied with copying America's homework anymore. It wants to overtake the US on the innovation front to support everything else it's doing to make its 2035 plan a reality. The only question now is, how could the US possibly counter all of this? Tariffs on imported goods from China may provide a short-term answer, though they could also harm the US in the long run. China could also use the tariffs as a way to influence other nations to move away from the US as a dominant trading partner. America could also invest in innovation to try to stay ahead of Beijing. Plus, it needs to find ways to overcome the BRICS and BRI problems. China has spent the last 3 decades intelligently making itself as close to indispensable as possible to the US. Meanwhile, it built influence elsewhere and undermined America's economy at every opportunity. The plan was always in place, and if nothing changes in America's approach, not just to China but its position in the global economy as a whole, there may be nothing to stop China from overtaking the US by 2035. And it won't even have to use a scrap of its growing military might to do it. But what do you think about China's grand plan for 2035? Will Beijing pull it off, or are there barriers that could prevent China from hitting its GDP growth targets? Let us know in the comments. Now go check out US plan if China takes Taiwan, or click on this video instead.